In the heart of Willow Creek, the Central Park served as a sanctuary of tranquility, with its expansive patches of lush grass and towering oaks casting sprawling shadows over the well-trodden paths. Mary had chosen a secluded wooden bench, partially hidden by the drooping branches of a large oak. Here, she hoped to find a moment of peace while nursing her infant, wrapped snugly in a light blue blanket that fluttered slightly in the gentle breeze. As Mary adjusted the blanket, ensuring her baby latched properly, her serene moment was abruptly shattered. An elderly lady, clad in a faded floral dress and clutching a large, weathered handbag, approached the bench with purposeful strides. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, rimmed with thick glasses, narrowed as she took in the scene before her. "Excuse me," she called out sharply, her voice carrying an unmistakable edge of disapproval that cut through the soft murmurs of the park. Mary looked up, startled by the intrusion. The lady stopped just a few feet away, planting her feet firmly on the ground as if bracing for confrontation. "I must say, I find it highly inappropriate for you to do that here in public, where everyone can see," the elderly woman declared, her tone steeped in reproach as she gestured vaguely with a quivering hand towards Mary. Mary felt a flush of heat creep up her neck, her initial surprise quickly morphing into discomfort. She tried to respond, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just feeding my—" No, this is not the place for such activities. It's indecent," the lady interrupted, her voice rising with each word, attracting the attention of nearby park-goers. Heads turned towards the bench, and a low murmur began to ripple through the crowd, a mix of curiosity and disquiet mingling in the air. Mary's hands tightened around her baby, who remained oblivious to the growing tension, nestled contentedly at her breast. The critical eyes of the strangers bore down on her, each gaze like a weight adding to the cloak of her unease. The elderly lady continued, unabated. "There are children here, families. You should show some respect for public decency." Her words, sharp and condemning, hung heavily between them. The confrontation had not only drawn the attention of casual bystanders, but also ignited a wave of murmurs that swelled with the passing seconds. Some onlookers nodded in agreement with the elderly lady, while others appeared uncomfortable, casting sympathetic glances at Mary. Amidst the building crowd, the scene was set for a deeper conflict, one that would challenge societal norms right there in the peaceful expanse of Willow Creek's Central Park. As the crowd's interest peaked, the stage was unwittingly set for an unexpected defender to emerge, marking the beginning of a significant series of events that would unfold in this seemingly quiet community. As the confrontation in the park escalated, the murmurs of the gathered crowd grew into a buzzing chorus, reflecting a blend of disapproval and support that ebbed and flowed around the central scene. It was into this charged atmosphere that Jack, a keen-eyed 12-year-old with an unyielding sense of fairness, entered the fray. Jack had been returning from school, his footsteps light on the gravel path, when the rising voices caught his attention. His backpack, weighed down with books and a slightly crushed sandwich, bounced against his shoulders as he paused to assess the situation. His gaze quickly took in the sight of Mary, visibly shaken as she tried to shield her baby from the prying eyes and harsh words of the elderly critic. Compelled by a deep-rooted conviction about the sanctity of a mother's right to care for her child without shame, Jack felt an instinctive urge to intervene. He approached the scene with a determined stride, his youthful face set in a frown of disapproval, not towards the act of breastfeeding, but towards the unwarranted judgment being passed. Stepping closer, Jack positioned himself between the elderly lady and Mary, serving as both shield and spokesperson. His voice, clear and surprisingly forceful for his age, broke through the cacophony of whispers. "Why should she hide while feeding her child?" he asked, his question rhetorical yet challenging, aimed directly at the critic. The elderly lady turned to face Jack, her expression one of bewildered reproof. Undeterred, Jack continued, "Eating is normal, natural, and necessary. It's nothing to be ashamed of, and certainly not something to hide." His words, spoken with a passionate sincerity, resonated with a part of the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions softening as they looked at Mary, who by now had managed to compose herself somewhat, drawing comfort from Jack's unexpected advocacy. Others in the crowd exchanged glances, their own discomfort evident as they pondered the young boy's arguments. The elderly lady attempted to interject, her voice trembling with indignation, but Jack's earnest plea for understanding cut her off. "We should be helping, not judging," he asserted, his young voice imbued with a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. This bold defense by Jack not only shifted the mood among the onlookers, but also marked a pivotal moment in the unfolding drama. His intervention served as a powerful reminder of the community's core values, challenging those gathered to reflect on their reactions and the implications of their public scrutiny. As Jack stood there, his backpack now resting by his feet, a silent assertion of his commitment to the cause, the dynamic in the park subtly changed. The whispers began to die down, replaced by a thoughtful silence as the crowd digested the scene before them. This moment of collective introspection, however, was abruptly disrupted by an unexpected new development. The sound of a car engine, growing louder as it approached, heralded the arrival of a new character into this public tableau, one whose presence would introduce yet another twist to the already complex narrative. The tension that had blanketed the park began to dissipate, replaced by a sudden and unexpected interruption. The tranquility of the afternoon was shattered by the aggressive screech of tires against the gravel, drawing all eyes toward the road. A sleek black luxury car, its polished surface gleaming under the sun's lingering rays, came to an abrupt halt at the curb near the gathered crowd. The vehicle's presence was incongruous against the backdrop of the casual park setting, its opulence stark and imposing. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped Edward Sullivan, a figure well known in the Willow Creek community, not only for his extensive business empire, but also for his vocal advocacy for women's rights. His appearance was as striking as his reputation. Dressed in a sharp, meticulously tailored suit that spoke of power and precision, he moved with an air of confidence that immediately commanded attention. His face, usually composed and unreadable, today bore an expression of concern mixed with resolve. Edward had been informed of the park confrontation by his secretary. Having been in the vicinity for a business meeting, he had directed his driver to the scene, driven by a sense of duty to intervene in a situation that aligned so closely with his principles. As he approached the crowd, his keen eyes quickly assessed the situation. Mary, attempting to regain her composure. Jack, standing defiantly as a young champion of justice. The elderly lady, now visibly shaken by the growing audience and the arrival of such an imposing figure. Edward's approach was measured, his footsteps resonant against the quiet that had settled over the park. The crowd parted slightly, their murmurs turning into whispers of speculation. "What is Edward Sullivan doing here?" someone asked, a question that rippled through the onlookers with growing curiosity. Reaching the center of the gathering, Edward addressed the elderly lady with a firm yet polite tone. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice carrying a calm authority that further quieted the bystanders. "I understand there are concerns about public decency here. However, we must also consider the rights and the dignity of every individual, especially a mother caring for her child." His words were not confrontational, but carried a weight that suggested the depth of his commitment to the principles he espoused. The elderly lady, taken aback by Edward's direct involvement, struggled to find a response, her earlier fervor dampened by his eloquent defense of Mary. As Edward turned his attention to Mary, offering a reassuring nod, he extended the discourse to those gathered, emphasizing the importance of empathy and support within the community. His presence not only altered the dynamics of the interaction, but also elevated the discussion to a broader reflection on community values and individual rights. This pivotal moment, however, was just the beginning of a deeper involvement for Edward, as he prepared to take more concrete steps to assist Mary and address the underlying issues highlighted by this incident. His next actions would further demonstrate his commitment to transforming this unexpected encounter into a meaningful catalyst for change. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the park, Edward Sullivan's presence seemed to usher in a sense of resolution. Standing amidst the quieted crowd, his stature and demeanor projected a calm authority that drew all eyes to him. After addressing the crowd and soothing the immediate tensions, he turned his full attention to the protagonists of the day's drama. Edward first acknowledged Jack, the young defender whose spirited advocacy had shifted the tone of the confrontation. "Well done, young man," he said, his voice imbued with genuine admiration. "It takes courage to stand up for what is right, especially in the face of opposition." Jack, momentarily taken aback by the recognition, nodded, his cheeks flushing with a mix of pride and surprise. Turning next to Mary, Edward's expression softened. He could see the residue of stress still lingering in her posture and the protective way she held her baby, now quietly dozing against her. Edward reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, retrieving a business card which he offered to her with a reassuring gesture. "Miss, should you face any difficulties from today's events, please do not hesitate to call me," Edward said, extending the card towards her. His offer was not merely a gesture of support, but a commitment. His firm, known for its legal prowess, was at the forefront of advocating for women's rights in Willow Creek. "You have every right to care for your child, wherever and whenever that care is needed." Mary, her expression transitioning from wary to relieved, accepted the card with a tentative smile. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I appreciate this very much," she murmured, her voice a low blend of gratitude and newfound confidence. The crowd, having witnessed the exchange, began to disperse slowly, the earlier tension dissipating into quiet conversations and reflective silences. Edward's intervention had not only diffused the situation, but had also left a mark on the onlookers, prompting them to reconsider their own views and the community's values. As Edward prepared to leave, his mind was already turning towards how he could further assist Mary beyond this immediate offer. He recognized in her situation not just an isolated incident, but a reflection of broader societal issues that needed addressing. The brief encounter had sparked a new resolve in him, a plan beginning to form on how he could integrate Mary's strengths into his business, seeing potential not just for her personal growth, but also for the enrichment of his team. His next steps would be crucial, not only in ensuring Mary's stability and well-being, but also in setting a precedent for how similar situations should be handled in the future. With a final nod to Jack and a word of thanks to the dispersing crowd, Edward turned back to his car, his mind already outlining the proposal he intended to make. A proposal that would significantly alter Mary's circumstances and set a new course for both of their futures. As the crowd thinned and the murmurs of the park faded into the background, Edward engaged Mary in a deeper conversation. He was keen to understand the full scope of her situation, beyond the immediate repercussions of the day's confrontation. Standing beside the park bench, with the calm of the late afternoon enveloping them, Edward listened intently as Mary shared her story. Mary explained her difficulties in securing employment that could accommodate her role as a single mother. The challenges were manifold, from inflexible hours that did not align with daycare timings to employers who were less understanding of the sudden emergencies that parenting often entails. Each word she spoke painted a picture of a determined woman repeatedly coming up against a system that seemed stacked against her. Edward nodded thoughtfully, his gaze occasionally shifting to the sleeping baby, a silent testament to the discussion's stakes. It was clear to him that Mary's resilience was an asset, one that had been honed by necessity and the fierce love for her child. He saw in her not just a candidate needing employment, but a potential asset to his company, someone whose real-life experience could bring invaluable perspective and diversity to his team. With the quiet confidence that characterized his decision-making, Edward broached the subject of employment. "Mary, I've listened to your story, and I believe you have exactly the kind of spirit and resilience we value in our company," he began, his voice firm yet encouraging. "I would like to offer you a position that not only respects your needs as a mother, but also values your potential as a professional." Mary looked at him, a mix of surprise and relief washing over her features. The offer was unexpected, a glimmer of hope on what had been an emotionally taxing day. Edward continued, detailing the specifics: flexible working hours, the possibility of remote work when needed, and a supportive team environment that understood the juggling act of parenthood. "This isn't just about providing a job," Edward emphasized. "It's about creating an environment where you and your child can thrive. I believe everyone deserves that chance, and our company can benefit greatly from someone with your strength and perspective." Mary, overwhelmed by the turn of events, felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. Her eyes, bright with unshed tears of gratitude, met Edward's. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I don't even know what to say except, yes, I'd love to join your team." As they shook hands, the agreement between them felt like more than just a professional contract. It was a pledge of mutual respect and support. Edward smiled, pleased with the outcome of what had begun as a distressing day in the park. As Mary and Edward concluded their agreement, Jack, who had been observing quietly from a distance, approached them. The boy's role in catalyzing this moment was not lost on Edward, and a new idea began to form, one that involved not just Mary, but also her courageous son. This thought would soon lead Edward to a deeper realization about his connection to Jack, setting the stage for further revelations and the unfolding of a more complex familial narrative. As the shadows lengthened in the park and the day began to fold into the cooler hues of the evening, a subtle but significant realization dawned on Edward. Watching Jack approach with a hesitant yet hopeful expression, Edward found himself unexpectedly looking at the boy with a new intensity, sensing a connection that went beyond the day's events. Jack, unaware of the undercurrents of this sudden scrutiny, simply smiled in gratitude at Edward for defending his mother and providing her a new opportunity. The boy's features, his mannerisms, a certain familiar tilt of his head as he spoke, each detail tugged at Edward's memory, awakening a long-buried acknowledgement that had been dismissed as coincidence or fleeting fancy in busier moments. As Mary and Jack prepared to leave, Edward's mind raced with the implications of his growing suspicion. Could the boy who had so bravely stood up in defense of his mother be more to him? The idea seemed to stretch the bounds of probability, yet the nagging sense of familiarity, the alignment of timelines, and now, the unmistakable pull of an almost paternal instinct refused to be ignored. Edward had known Rachel, Jack's mother, years ago in a chapter of his life marked by youthful ambition and a reckless romance. Their relationship, intense and brief, had ended when their lives took divergent paths. Rachel had moved away, and their contact had dwindled to a smattering of brief exchanges before fading out entirely. Edward had heard she'd had a child, but the rush of his own life had prevented any inquiry into that whispered piece of news. Now, as he watched Jack walk away, the possibility that this spirited young defender could be his own son enveloped Edward in a mixture of astonishment and apprehension. How had he not seen it before? The timeline, the abrupt end of his relationship with Rachel, her sudden move, everything pointed to a secret now personified in Jack. Compelled by a newfound urgency, Edward knew he needed to reach out to Rachel, to confront the past and unearth the truth of Jack's parentage. The implications of this discovery were profound, not just for him, but for Jack and Mary as well. What had begun as a simple act of public defense was unraveling into a narrative threaded with personal revelations and the potential for life-changing connections. As Edward made his way back to his car, the weight of the impending conversation with Rachel loomed large. He was about to step into a part of his history that he had left unexamined for too long, driven by the imperative to know whether the courageous boy who had stood up in the park was his son. This inquiry, he knew, would open the door to a chapter filled with potential joy and inevitable challenges, as the truth about Jack's paternity was poised to redefine their futures. The atmosphere in Edward Sullivan's corporate boardroom, usually a space echoing with the clatter of negotiations and decisions, was transformed into a welcoming area for the informal gathering he had organized. The event was meant to celebrate Mary's joining the company, an occasion marked by light refreshments and the easy chatter of new and potential colleagues mingling. Banners congratulating Mary fluttered gently from the walls, and laughter mingled with the soft background music, creating a warm, congenial atmosphere. Edward, ever the gracious host, was making his rounds, ensuring that Mary felt welcomed and integral to the team. His demeanor, usually so controlled and commanding, today bore a lighter, more personable aspect as he engaged with his employees. However, his polished exterior masked an undercurrent of anticipation and nerves about the impending conversation he planned to have with Rachel about Jack. As the gathering hit its stride, the main doors to the boardroom opened with a quiet click that went unnoticed by most, but drew Edward's immediate attention. Into the room stepped Rachel, the woman from Edward's past, whose memory had recently resurfaced with such unexpected implications. Her appearance was as poised as ever, her elegant attire understating her purposeful intrusion into Edward's professional world. Rachel's entry was discreet, yet to Edward, it seemed as though every decibel of sound in the room had suddenly amplified. His heart thudded irregularly as he watched her scan the room before her eyes settled on him. The murmur of the room continued unabated, the other attendees oblivious to the significance of her presence. As Rachel made her way toward him, Edward excused himself from the small group he was conversing with, his steps measured as he approached her. The few meters between them felt like a much greater distance, each step heavy with the weight of years and secrets untold. "Rachel," Edward greeted, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "This is a surprise." Her smile was taut, an echo of the complexity of their shared history. "Edward, we need to talk," she said, her voice low, meant only for his ears. He nodded, a gesture of assent to the inevitable. Guiding her slightly away from the main throng of the party to a quieter corner of the room, Edward braced himself. The moment he had anticipated and dreaded was unfolding, and the privacy of their conversation felt stark against the backdrop of the ongoing celebration. "I'm here about Jack," Rachel began, her words cutting cleanly through any pretense. "There's something you need to know, something I should have told you long ago." Edward's response was a nod, his expression composed as he prepared to face whatever truths Rachel was about to unveil. The weight of the moment hung between them, a palpable tension that contrasted sharply with the festive noise at their backs. Rachel's next words, he knew, would change everything. As she drew in a deep breath, ready to reveal the secrets of the past, Edward felt the course of his future, and Jack's, hinging on what she was about to disclose. The impact of this conversation was poised to ripple out, affecting not just their lives, but also the lives of everyone connected to them, as they stood on the precipice of a revelation that would reshape their understanding of family and identity. In the secluded corner of the bustling company gathering, the world as Edward knew it seemed to slow down, each second stretching longer than the last as Rachel prepared to disclose the truths long hidden. The noise of the celebration receded into a distant hum, irrelevant to the gravity of the moment unfolding between them. Rachel's eyes held a mix of resolve and regret as she looked at Edward, her lips parting to reveal the secret that had burdened her for over a decade. "Jack is your son, Edward," she confessed, the words dropping into the space between them with the weight of a stone in still water. The impact of her words was immediate and profound. Edward felt a jolt, as if the ground beneath him shifted. His expression, always so carefully managed, faltered as the implications of her revelation sank in. He was a father, a fact that until now had been a missing piece of his identity he hadn't known was lost. Around them the party continued, but for Edward, the festive atmosphere turned surreal. The laughter and light-hearted conversation seemed disjointed from the emotional turbulence he now found himself in. He took a moment to steady himself, his mind racing to align this new reality with the life he had known. Rachel watched him closely, her own anxiety about his reaction palpable. "I should have told you sooner," she admitted, her voice a whisper barely audible above the gentle strains of music in the background. "But I was afraid of disrupting your life, afraid of how you would react." Edward's initial shock slowly morphed into a complex tapestry of emotions, surprise, confusion, and an emerging sense of responsibility. He looked toward the crowd, his gaze inadvertently catching Jack's, who was laughing at something a colleague had said. The boy's joyful unawareness of the conversation about him added a poignant layer to Edward's turmoil. The news, though personal and private, inevitably began to ripple outward as Edward and Rachel continued their conversation. Observant colleagues noticed their intense discussion and the unusual solemnity of Edward's demeanor. Whispers began to circulate, speculations building in hushed tones that threaded through the crowd, igniting curiosity and concern. Edward was acutely aware of the growing whispers, feeling the eyes of his employees on him as he navigated his initial reactions. The dual challenge of maintaining his composure as a leader while internally grappling with the news of his paternity tested his resolve. He knew the revelation would not stay contained within the walls of this room. It would seep into the fabric of the company and possibly beyond. As the initial shock began to settle, Edward's thoughts turned to Jack. The reality of being a father, of having a son he had unknowingly missed so many years of life with, was overwhelming. Yet, amidst the storm of his emotions, a resolve began to form. Edward knew he needed to step into this new role with the dignity and commitment it deserved. Determined to address the situation with the care it warranted, Edward excused himself from Rachel, signaling that their conversation would continue in a more private setting. He needed time to process the information, to plan how to introduce himself into Jack's life responsibly and thoughtfully, without causing further disruption. As he moved away from Rachel and started towards Jack, each step felt like a bridge crossing into a new chapter of his life. The revelations of today were just the beginning, and the path forward was uncertain but necessary. The transition into the next phase of his life, as a father reconnecting with his son, promised to reshape his future in ways he had never imagined. In the days following the revelation, Edward found himself in uncharted territory. As the initial shock of discovering his connection to Jack subsided, a resolve took its place, an earnest desire to forge a meaningful relationship with his newly discovered son. The challenge was not merely in accepting his role as a father, but in navigating the delicate process of entering Jack's life in a way that was respectful to both the boy and his mother, Rachel. Edward's approach was methodical and considerate. He started by arranging private meetings with Rachel to discuss the best way to introduce himself to Jack as his father. These discussions were filled with caution and the mutual understanding of the need for sensitivity. Rachel, while supportive, was also protective, her maternal instincts finely tuned to any sign of distress that this might cause her son. Together, they agreed on a gradual introduction, starting with Edward attending Jack's school events as a supporter, not yet revealing their biological connection. Edward watched from the sidelines during Jack's soccer games, clapping quietly, a proud yet distant figure observing the boys' interactions and camaraderie with teammates. Each of these encounters was meticulously planned, yet laden with an emotional complexity that often left Edward feeling both fulfilled and heartbreakingly distant. He longed to step forward, to celebrate victories and console defeats as a father would, but restrained himself to the boundaries they had set, understanding the need for a slow and steady approach. Meanwhile, Edward also sought advice from professionals. He consulted child psychologists to understand the potential impacts of his sudden entry into Jack's life, ensuring he was equipped to handle the emotional nuances of their evolving relationship. His nights were often spent reading books on fatherhood, on the complexities of blended families, and on the psychological development of children who face familial revelations as profound as Jack's. As weeks turned into months, the initial awkwardness that marked their interactions at soccer games and school events began to soften. Jack, initially unaware of Edward's true identity, gradually became accustomed to his presence. The boy's inquisitive nature led him to ask questions, to which Edward responded with careful honesty, revealing bits of his own life and interests without yet bridging the gap to their true relationship. Their conversations, though light, were stepping stones, laying a foundation of trust and familiarity upon which Edward hoped to build a lasting bond. He was ever mindful of the pace at which they proceeded, always deferring to Rachel's insights into how Jack was handling the new adult in his life. The slow and deliberate building of their relationship was punctuated by moments of poignant realization for Edward, of birthdays missed, first steps not seen, and school achievements not celebrated together. Each realization strengthened his determination to not waste any more time, yet also deepened his respect for the process they had embarked upon. As Edward prepared for the moment when he would finally tell Jack the full truth, he felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. This next step, he knew, would be the most significant yet, a moment that could potentially draw them closer or place a new strain on their budding connection. His thoughts were consumed with planning for this disclosure, aware that the outcome would shape their relationship for years to come. The slow transformation of Edward, Mary, and Jack's relationships was set against the backdrop of a community still buzzing with the remnants of the park incident. While they navigated their personal journeys, an unexpected development began to unfold publicly that tied back to that fateful day. A local journalist, initially drawn to the story by the spectacle of a prominent businessman intervening in a public dispute, had started digging deeper into the identities and motivations of those involved. The elderly lady, whose confrontation with Mary had set everything in motion, became a particular focus of this investigation. As the journalist peeled back layers of her seemingly simple life, a more complex picture began to emerge. This woman, known in the community for her staunch views but considered relatively harmless, was revealed to be a key figure in a conservative group actively campaigning against public breastfeeding. Her presence at the park that day had not been coincidental. It was part of a broader agenda to sway public opinion on what she and her group deemed moral issues. The journalist uncovered connections between her and several influential conservative circles that Edward had publicly opposed in his advocacy for women's rights. As the findings were published, the community reacted with a mixture of surprise and indignation. The article detailed not just the woman's affiliations, but also her history of similar confrontations, painting a picture of a well-orchestrated effort to influence public spaces and policies. This disclosure resonated deeply within the community, igniting vigorous debates over the rights of individuals versus imposed societal norms. Edward, upon reading the article, felt a complex mix of vindication and concern. Vindication because his instincts about the incident had been correct. Concern because it highlighted a more significant societal issue that had directly impacted Mary and, indirectly, his newfound family. It spurred him to think about the broader implications of his role as a public figure and a business leader. How could he leverage his influence to foster more inclusive and supportive community norms? Mary, too, found herself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight once again. This time, however, the narrative shifted. She was no longer just a victim of public scrutiny, but a symbol of the challenges and discriminations faced by mothers everywhere. Her story, linked to the journalist's revelations, sparked a broader dialogue about motherhood, public spaces, and the rights to personal freedom. As the community grappled with these revelations, Edward, Mary, and Jack found themselves at the center of a burgeoning movement. Inspired by the support and also by the opposition they encountered, they began to see their personal experiences as part of a larger narrative about rights and acceptance. Edward felt a renewed commitment to use his resources not just to defend Mary and Jack, but also to challenge and change the societal norms that had led to their ordeal. This awakening, while challenging, fortified their bond and sense of purpose. It was clear that the journey they were on was about more than just personal reconciliation. It was about advocating for change. As they prepared to launch a campaign to promote awareness and acceptance for public breastfeeding, the trio found themselves stepping into roles they had never anticipated, ready to influence society in ways they had never imagined. With the revelations of the park incident and the underlying societal biases it exposed, Edward, Mary, and Jack found themselves at a pivotal moment. The trio, each affected in profoundly personal ways by the events, recognized an opportunity to catalyze change not just for themselves, but for the broader community. Inspired by the groundswell of support and the pressing need for societal growth, they decided to launch a comprehensive public awareness campaign centered around breastfeeding rights and the broader issues of parental freedoms in public spaces. Edward leveraged his extensive network of business contacts and his access to media channels to lay the groundwork for the campaign. His company's marketing team, skilled in crafting compelling messages and visuals, was brought on board to ensure the campaign's professionalism and reach. Edward's resources provided the necessary foundation, but it was Mary's story that would be at the heart of the campaign, a real, relatable narrative that could resonate with people across different walks of life. Mary took on the role of spokesperson with a mixture of determination and nervousness. She shared her story in interviews, blog posts, and public service announcements, recounting her experience in the park and framing it within the larger context of the rights of mothers and the normalization of breastfeeding in public. Her candidness and poise in discussing her challenges and triumphs struck a chord with many, garnering support from parents and non-parents alike who felt moved by her sincerity and strength. Jack, too, found a role in this campaign, speaking to the youth and his peers about respect, equality, and the importance of supporting one another regardless of societal prejudices. His previous defense of his mother in the park made him a powerful example of young leadership and courage, making his contributions to the campaign especially impactful among younger audiences. Together, they organized events, participated in panel discussions, and collaborated with other organizations advocating for parental rights and women's health. They facilitated workshops that educated the public on the legal rights of breastfeeding mothers and created safe spaces for discussions about the challenges parents face in public areas. The campaign slowly gained momentum, turning personal strife into a robust platform for advocacy. Billboards, social media hashtags, and merchandise with empowering messages became ubiquitous in Willow Creek and beyond. The message spread, encouraging a reevaluation of outdated norms and fostering a more inclusive and supportive public atmosphere. As the campaign's influence widened, Edward, Mary, and Jack saw tangible changes in public perception. Local businesses and public facilities began to openly support breastfeeding, with some establishments even setting aside dedicated spaces for nursing mothers. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive, reinforcing the trio's belief in the power of advocacy and the impact of sharing personal stories to inspire social change. Their efforts, however, were not without opposition. Some conservative groups pushed back, sparking debates and discussions that sometimes escalated into broader dialogues about family values and personal freedoms. These challenges only fueled the campaign further, highlighting the necessity of their fight for change and the importance of dialogue in overcoming societal barriers. As they prepared for a major community event to celebrate the campaign's successes and to outline future steps, Edward, Mary, and Jack reviewed the journey they had embarked upon. What had started as a distressing incident in a local park had blossomed into a powerful movement, reshaping their community's values and their own lives in ways none of them had anticipated. The journey of Edward, Mary, and Jack had transformed from a personal challenge into a public crusade, culminating in a significant press conference that was set to highlight the progress of their awareness campaign and outline their vision for the future. The venue chosen for this pivotal event was the Central Park, the very place where the initial confrontation that sparked their movement had occurred. It was a symbolic choice, representing a full circle from conflict to transformation. As the day of the press conference arrived, the park was abuzz with activity. Media outlets had set up their cameras, reporters checked their microphones, and a crowd of supporters, curious onlookers, and even some skeptics gathered, all eager to hear the outcomes and future directives of the campaign. Banners fluttering gently in the breeze bore messages of support for breastfeeding rights and parental freedoms, creating a backdrop of solidarity and advocacy. Jack, who had matured significantly through his involvement in the campaign, was scheduled to speak. This young man, once an unwitting participant in a public dispute, had grown into a confident advocate for change. As he stepped up to the podium, the crowd quieted, their attention focusing on him with a mix of anticipation and respect. With a calm and measured demeanor, Jack began his speech. He talked about the day in the park, not just as a moment of personal trial, but as a catalyst for a broader conversation about rights, respect, and community responsibility. What began as a moment of contention has grown into a collective call to action, he stated, his voice clear and resonant, echoing through the assembled microphones. Jack touched on the themes of family and acceptance, weaving his personal story with the broader narrative of the campaign. We've come together not just to support one another as a community, but to challenge ourselves to think and act with empathy and understanding, he continued. His speech highlighted the ongoing struggles for women's rights, emphasizing that the fight for equality in public spaces was far from over. His words struck a chord with many in the crowd, drawing nods, applause, and even a few emotional tears from those who felt the weight of his message. The impact of his speech was palpable, resonating not just with those present, but also with viewers watching through various media channels. As Jack concluded, he called for continued advocacy and vigilance, reminding everyone that societal change was an ongoing effort requiring the commitment of all community members. Let us move forward not just with the intent to tolerate, but with the conviction to embrace and uplift each other, he urged. His final words a powerful plea for progress and unity. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and sustained, a testament to the resonance of his message and the community's readiness to embrace the changes he advocated. As the crowd began to disperse, conversations sparked among groups of attendees, discussing the implications of Jack's words and the steps they could personally take to contribute to the campaign's goals. The press conference not only marked a milestone for the awareness campaign, but also solidified Jack's role as a leader and advocate in his community. As Edward, Mary, and Jack regrouped after the event, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point, they felt a renewed sense of purpose and a deep appreciation for the strides they had made, both as a family and as catalysts for community change. As autumn ushered in cooler breezes and the gentle fall of leaves in Willow Creek, the effects of the awareness campaign initiated by Edward, Mary, and Jack continued to ripple through the community. What had started as a single act of defiance and a plea for understanding had blossomed into a robust movement, altering perceptions and influencing policies around public breastfeeding and parental rights. In the weeks following the press conference, the local newspapers and social media were abuzz with stories of individuals and institutions taking steps to implement more inclusive practices. Coffee shops, libraries, and public parks began to proudly display signs that read "Breastfeeding Welcome Here," a direct result of the advocacy that Edward, Mary, and Jack had championed. Schools and community centers started to organize workshops and discussions about gender equality and rights in public spaces, inspired by Jack's powerful speeches and Mary's courageous story. Edward's company took a leading role, establishing a corporate policy that not only facilitated support for breastfeeding employees, but also encouraged other businesses to follow suit. As the impact of their efforts became more visible, Edward, Mary, and Jack were invited to another significant community event, this time to celebrate the strides made towards a more inclusive society. The event was held in the same park where the journey had begun, now transformed into a symbol of community and progress. Families gathered, some participants of the initial confrontation, now more aware and supportive, came to show their solidarity and gratitude. The atmosphere was festive, filled with the laughter of children playing and the friendly chatter of neighbors discussing the positive changes. Local leaders and advocates spoke, citing the campaign as a pivotal moment in the community's history. They praised Edward, Mary, and Jack for their courage and leadership, acknowledging how their personal struggles had sparked a broader dialogue and action. As they stood together watching the community interact, the trio reflected on their journey. Edward felt a profound sense of pride and accomplishment, not just in his personal connection to Jack and his role as a father, but also as a catalyst for change in his community. Mary, once isolated in her struggle, now found herself a respected advocate and a beacon of hope for many mothers. Jack, young yet wise beyond his years, understood the power of voice and action, energized by the difference he could make. The echoes of their actions, now manifested in the community's evolving norms and policies, promised a future where public breastfeeding and parental rights were respected and celebrated. The park, filled with the joyful noises of a community coming together, stood as a testament to the enduring impact of their campaign. As the event drew to a close, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the smiling faces, illuminating the park with hues of hope and renewal. Edward, Mary, and Jack linked hands, their unity a symbol of their shared journey and their collective hope for continued progress. They looked out over the crowd, their hearts full, knowing that the echoes of their actions would resonate for generations, weaving their story into the larger tapestry of societal advancement.
So, if you're not subscribed yet, click on the subscribe button below and join our community. Thank you for your support and see you in the next videos.